But let's say, very good morning to Peter Hitchens. How are you?
Morning.
How's it going?
Well, it's nice to be back on genuine, honest time instead of Berlin time. That
Yes.
We've been forced to
Well, we had a
months.
fascinating conversation about this. I think must have been this time last year, I suppose.
I think it does tend to come up.
And which Chris Evans became very, very fascinated by, because he couldn't believe how complex this whole thing was. And
Nobody understands it.
And your explanation of how we got there. So without rehearsing all of it again, the bottom line is, you wrote in your column this week on Sunday that as you wake up this morning to this, you should be feeling better, because the circadian rhythm of sort of what is called Greenwich Mean Time.
There is actually serious medical research which shows that when the clocks go the other way, when they push them forwards to be dishonest in March, then quite large numbers of people fall ill. It creates, or is associated with the creation of heart arrhythmia, which can lead to strokes. And this isn't just made up stuff. This is real research.
But what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, it's the same as jet lag. If you know perfectly well, you move out of the time zone to which you are accustomed, you feel tired and stressed in abnormal ways. What you do when you move the clocks forward, away from where they ought to be, is to create a sort of miniature jet lag, but without the fun.
Yes. I must confess, I woke up this morning and felt good about the fact that it was lighter.
Yes,
one thing I don't like is waking up in the dark.
Well, that is the main difference. If you move the clocks forwards at any time, what you mean, you get more light in the evening and less light in the morning. The amount of daylight remains the same, but because we're all governed by things like broadcasting schedules, school opening times, work opening times, and the whole way in which life is arranged, the clocks, even if we pay no attention to them, they have a huge effect on how we live, and it's particularly if you commute long distance or have children to get to school. It's as if one morning you got a letter from your school's head saying, as of next Monday, we require you to bring your child to school 1 hour earlier. And a letter from your employer at the same time, as of next Monday, we require you to attend work 1 hour earlier. And all the broadcasting begins 1 hour earlier. That's basically what happens when you fiddle with the clocks. But people don't understand this. I only understand it because I once flew backwards across the international date line. And the experience was so fascinating that I fell to thinking about it.
What was that? Tell us more about that.
When I left the Soviet Union after 2.5 years, I decided I had to do it in some way that was not ordinary. So I managed to get permission to go. I wanted to walk across the Bering Strait because it does freeze. Yeah. They wouldn't do that because there's too much electronic stuff there, surveillance, but they would allow me to go to a place called Providenia, which is the last place in Siberia. And to fly from there, I flew from Providenia to Nome in Alaska. I left Providenia in Russia late on Monday morning, and I arrived in Nome, Alaska at lunchtime the previous Sunday. And so I gained an entire day, which I'm keeping, and it's an extraordinary thing. And once you look into this, you begin to realize what this time stuff is about.
I once put the proposition to somebody that if you had been able to still fly on Concorde, if you continually flied west on Concorde, and I don't even know whether you would continue to call it west, depending on how you go around the globe, but I guess you would, from London, fly west. If you continue to fly, stopping only for short trips to take a photograph or something in New York, California, because you're effectively flying quicker than any other method of flight, could you, because you would fly to New York, you would leave here, I think, at say 9 o'clock in the morning, and it was only a 3-hour flight. So you would get there local time before you left.
I mean, the time I did take Concorde, which was very early in its existence, when you could only fly to Washington D.C., I think we did arrive more or less exactly the time we'd left.
Yes.
So we'd basically the time spent flying was cancelled out on the way back, flying eastwards. It was an extraordinarily accelerated evening, which I found very disconcerting. Yes, and actually made me feel quite strange. Yes. You left in the early afternoon. Suddenly it was absolutely dark night. Right. Not long after leaving the American coast. Right. Very strange experience.
That would be weird.
It does mess with the time.
Yeah, but going the other way, if there were no delays and you it took 3 hours, if you left London at 9 a.m, you would, which is only 4 a.m. in Washington D.C. You would arrive in Washington D.C. around 7 a.m. So effectively,
Yeah,
you're
I think
saving
it's
time.
slightly longer than
3.5 maybe, but still, but you still get there before you left.
It was odd. It was definitely.
So if you, my theory being, if you continued all the way round and came back to London, having gone that way, what would happen?
Well, then you have to fling in the international date line, of course, because you would then fly forwards across the international date line if you were going that way.
Right.
I was going east.
Yes.
So that's how I went backwards. If you went the other way, you'd lose an entire day.
And is that all invented time then?
Well, longitude.
Time zones.
Longitude is an invented measure of a real thing.
Right.
There are 360 degrees. There could equally well, if they measure the degree in a different way, be 5,000 degrees, but there are in fact 360.
Yes.
And 15 of those cover an hour of the 24 it takes the Earth to rotate. The basic thing you can't alter is the time it takes for the Earth to rotate.
Yes.
It's just an attempt to measure it. The lines of longitude, unlike latitude, are completely arbitrary. The fact that the zero meridian runs through Greenwich is a matter of political power.
Yeah.
We
invented
made
that.
it so. The French hated it.
Right.
And they spent...
Why didn't they have their own?
Well, they tried to have their own, but in fact, they had a very curious designation of Greenwich Mean Time as Paris time plus 90 minutes or something. But they wouldn't accept it. And in the end, after 100 years of bitter diplomacy, they caused Greenwich Mean Time to stop being called Greenwich Mean Time, to be called Universal Coordinated Time, which is now its official name. They hate it.
Is it really? See, I've never called it.
No, it isn't Greenwich Mean Time anymore.
So, but it's still...
I know so much of this stuff.
No, this is what I love talking to you about it for, because but I still see GMT written down.
Well, only here. Nowhere else in the world.
Okay. Because I think you also explained...
UCC.
Did you not also explain their mad plan to have a sort of metric system for time?
They did. They tried to have... the French revolutionaries tried to have 10-hour days and 10-day weeks.
Right.
Though they did have 12 months. They couldn't, I think, work out how to do it in 10 months. And the problem with 10-day weeks is, of course, the weekend comes around less frequently, and that is very unpopular. Yes. So
particularly now with the work-life balance
revolted again. But if you look in very high-class antique shops in Paris, you can sometimes find the beautiful old 18th century clocks with the 10-hour.
That's amazing.
Day marked on them.
Because you also wrote about a dozen this weekend.
Oh, the dozen, yeah.
And how the dozen has kind of disappeared.
Well, I just noticed going around a particular supermarket.
I love this stuff.
They were selling eggs in tens, which is what they do on the continent.
Right.
But here we tend to buy them by the half dozen, or occasionally. I haven't seen a dozen eggs.
Well, you wouldn't buy 5, would you?
Well, I wouldn't.
I mean, how would you make a box for 5 eggs?
Well, it would be odd. That's
single.
why it's 10, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, that's why it's 6, presumably, because it's an even number.
Well, I suppose so, but when eggs were originally sold in dozens, in half dozens, they were sold in bags.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a young man, I don't think you could buy a dozen eggs. I mean, that was rather large extravagance. You just bought 6.
Yeah, but it is a different measure.
Yeah.
So, but all kinds of things were still then done in 12 pennies to a shilling.
Yeah.
And 12 inches to a foot, which have now more or less faded from the minds of millions of people. But to me, because 12 is actually a rather good base of calculation.
I meet people now who don't know what a foot is.
Yeah.
Or a yard.
Well, it's 30 centimetres, isn't it? Which is oddly enough the length of the rulers in continental schools.
But and yet we still use...
They still have a foot, but they're called...
I don't know what they do in Europe, to be fair, but in terms of a football penalty area, it's 18 yards. It's the 18-yard box.
I don't know what they do.
I don't know what they call it in Europe. I've never thought about that. But if you go to the Bernabeu, for example, to watch Real Madrid, do they have an 18-yard area?
You'd have to check out it. What I do know is that somebody once was asked to mark out a cricket pitch, and he thought the 22 metres would be the same as 22 yards. And so he marked it out in metres instead of yards, and the result, the effect on play, was appalling.
Yeah.
It just didn't work.
Right.
The difference was considerable. So,
yes.
But I imagine they have a metric version of it.
Yes. It is fascinating, though, because, I mean, we are governed so much by time because we never have enough of it, for a start.
Yeah.
You always need more of it. But what would actually be the case if they didn't change the clocks, right? What would happen?
Well, it depends when they didn't.
Spring. Well, say in the spring.
When they didn't change them.
Well, if they kept them as they are now, and they got round to whenever they would normally move the clocks forward,
and left them as they are.
What would be the effect of that?
Everybody would be much happier. There would be a lot of people who wouldn't get ill
But practically, how would we know?
Practically, you wouldn't know, particularly because there is a fixed amount of daylight. You can't alter the amount of daylight by changing the clocks. It's a fantasy. The phrase "daylight saving time" is ridiculous because you can't change the amount of daylight. It just means it's actually, in general, if you leave it where it is, the evenings come slightly earlier and the mornings. In the summertime, likewise come slightly earlier.
But in the summertime, you got more light anyway.
But if you're used to it, but until I think is it 15 or 16? Until the middle of the First World War, that was normal anyway. There are jokes about this in P.G. Wodehouse novels of how the changing of the clocks during and after the First World War messes about with time, and it does. It basically means the evening comes earlier than. I mean, we've all had the clocks put forward, bizarrely in summer, for pretty much a century now, so people are used to it.
Right.
So
it stays light longer, or
it would be dark a little earlier.
Yes, which wouldn't matter much in the summer.
Well, people always say that if the clocks are kept forward and it's lighter later in the evening, everyone will go out and do open air Shakespeare and play tennis. But what everybody will do is the same as they always do: slump in front of the television and go to the pub, and it won't make any difference at all. It's a fantasy. And all the claims of what it will do, it will save so much energy and all the rest of it, they're all couched in with that wonderful verb could, or its friend may, which equally well means could, not, or may not. And there's no actual proof that it's ever done the slightest good at all. But it's an obsession with the sort of people who like to fiddle with our lives. But it's fundamental. It's as if to get people to drive more slowly, the speedometer of every car was made to read 40 miles an hour when the car was actually doing 30. It's a fantasy to imagine that by fiddling around with the measures of things you alter reality.
I'm reliably informed that it's just called the penalty box, which doesn't sound very European to me. Terry in Ramsbottom, I think, is having a laugh. He says European football fields have a 15.459 metre box. It must be 18 yards then, by the sounds of it.
Well, it sounds about right, but I mean, I would have to get a calculator out and work it out. But presumably they have some expression.
Somebody's also asking, isn't December the 10th month?
Well, it was in the Roman calendar, yes. And then they bunged in a couple of extra ones.
Yeah, so it's fascinating stuff. Let's talk about the big story of the day and probably the week, I dare say, because we've been talking about it for a long time here on this station. But the illegal migrant problem, where they had, I think, 1,900 came this weekend alone, which would suggest if that continues, that's just 2,000 every weekend until Christmas. Is another.
Well, the weather will worsen, I think. Which makes a big difference. But nonetheless, I mean, I went down.
Or it may not. It's very clement at the moment. Isn't it?
But I think the forecast is for quite rough weather in the Channel. Yeah. But the thing is that I went down there to take a look, and in fact, the day I was there was a crosswind and there was nobody landing. But it was quite obvious from all the stories that everybody told me that the Channel used to be a psychological barrier. People thought this was a dangerous stretch of sea, which of course it is.
It is, supposedly.
Traffic, but they didn't dare cross it. But now that's gone. People think that it's crossable, and so they cross it. So what's happened is we effectively have a land border with France to all intents and purposes. So the key to anything that we do is France. If we can get the French to prevent people from actually getting onto the water, then we've solved that particular problem. Yes. And I think that no effort should be spared in doing so. I'm actually quite an admirer of France. I think it's in some ways a very well and sensibly governed country. It certainly has a very powerful state when it chooses to use it. And if the French state could be recruited to do so, obviously that's going to involve money, because it's not particularly to their benefit. Though I think in the long run...
Well, we've tried giving them money and
we haven't ever done it enough. It's never been properly applied. And you have silly people in British government who make daft remarks about, is France really our friend, and stuff like that, which sets back. And of course the quibbles about the European Union issue. But I think if a British Prime Minister, I think this has to go, Prime Minister, President, went to President Macron and asked him to take the matter really seriously on a basis of and we'd have to spend a lot, because basically the French are not going to want British police or British soldiers patrolling their coast. They're probably keener on national sovereignty than anybody else in the world. They're not going to. It has to be them doing it.
Yes.
So we have to pay them. I think it's worth it. I would cancel HS2 tonight to spend the money on persuading France to patrol the Channel.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for cancelling HS2. I mean,
many reasons.
I don't know how far along they are, but what I do know is they're very far along the route of purchasing properties and
they're far along the very difficult contracts, which are hard to get out of. But I don't care. I think it was always a mistake, and in any case I think the money would be better spent on this purpose.
Yes.
And I think it could be done, but it needs resolve, and it needs an intelligent, grown-up attitude towards France, to which they would, in my view, respond.
Yes.
And well, I mean, although it would stop. If they can stop it if they want to. The moment they don't much care.
Well, there's no question, I think, that the problem is not so much what you do with people when they get here, it's stopping them
once
coming.
they're here, that's it.
Once they're here, they never leave.
You might get 1% of them to leave after they arrive if you're very, very lucky. But in the meantime,
but they now apparently have got worked out that even if they are deported, kicked out, they come back again.
Well, very possibly,
and that way they can reapply.
I mean, international law makes it incredibly difficult to expel people once they've arrived from any country if they claim that they are seeking refuge, and it's very hard to prove that they're not. And frankly, in many cases, beyond us to do so.
Because also the rules...
These are the ones who are actually in the centres. There's very large numbers who, I think, from what I saw of the way the coast is there, who simply come ashore and are met by Confederates and disappear without trace, and so we have no record of them. I think the numbers coming across are probably significantly larger than the ones that are reported.
They are. I mean, what people say in the immigration business is that there was a time when more people came on lorries because they could smuggle their way into Britain that way, but that's been pretty much curtailed, and it's much more difficult now to do.
It is difficult.
So more of them have come by boat because it's easy.
Of course, horrible things happen, but these are we have to understand this. These are. I have no criticisms of the people for trying to get into the country.
No, I don't.
I think
because why wouldn't
enterprising? Here it is.
Yeah.
I think that there's a much deeper problem in Britain, which we don't ever address, which is why is it that that quite a lot of people in this country welcome migration? It's because there are a lot of jobs which ought to be done by indigenous people, but the indigenous people, I believe, thanks to an education system which is one of the worst in the advanced world, and also the general break-up of the family, that an awful lot of British people are not willing to work in the kind of jobs which immigrants will do. And I think that's that is an absurdity which ought to be corrected.
My son has got a job.
We need to rebuild the schools, and we need to rebuild family life.
My son has got a job in a well-known pizza place, shall we say. Everybody else working there is foreign. Everyone.
Oh, this is quite common.
Right? Yeah. And that's the thing. How about this from Mr. W? Back in the 70s, I was a radio operator in the Royal Navy. All signals were sent with a time of 4 digits followed by a Z, Zulu, this being what was GMT, now UCT. Local time was different outside of home waters, so we had 2 clocks, one for each.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
2 clocks
Zulu is generally the military term for what we call Greenwich, and everybody else calls UTC.
One final thing to talk about was your main piece this week about yet another terrible, grisly, awful murder.
Yes, it was so distressing. I mean, these were people who'd reached the ends of their lives. They were in their 80s, and she let the cat out, and in through the door came this monster who then appears to spend the entire night torturing these 2 old people to try and get them to tell him where the money was. It's just, I don't know. It was blamed partly on his gambling habit, something which is now called an addiction, which I've no doubt he gambled heavily and got himself into great debts. I asked the local police whether they'd investigated his drug use. They said they had, and it turned up nothing, which is better than most police forces in this.
Who don't even say.
They will refuse to discuss it, because I think most police forces are embarrassed by the fact they do nothing to prevent drug abuse, and they have a suspicion that it may be behind crimes of this guy. So I can't say whether this guy was in fact deranged by drugs, but an awful lot of crimes of this kind. And I draw attention to the website Attacker Smoke Cannabis, where these things are monitored. All local papers are monitored, and he lists. Mr. Granger, who runs it, lists every crime where marijuana is an element. It's very, very common, so I think it might well be. I just think these people, the world they grew up in was simply not one in which people would come into your house and torture you to death. And that change. These are people who grew up in the 40s. That change in our life is huge, and I think it's time it was reversed.
Absolutely right. Well, we've got a police chief today. We're going to talk about it next, after you go, who's now saying, actually, we're safer now than we were 20 years ago. The reason that it looks as though crime is going up is because we're recording more crime. And you go, well, that's not actually the reason. It is more dangerous now than it was 20 years ago. I'm sure of that.
Do you remember the terrible case? I'm starting to remember the names of the people involved. One was called Francesca, where a woman and her slightly disabled, I think, daughter died. She burnt them both to death in their car because they'd been more or less driven mad by persecution by neighbours because of the girl's disability, and this is the problem. How do you record what was happening to those people? What is it? And this is the kind of thing which the police can easily say, well, that's not a crime. But actually, many, many people's lives are made to complete misery by harassment of this kind. And they do go almost mad. Of course, the other great scourge of noise and of people hanging around in the street outside and vandalising people's cars and possessions and wrecking their front gardens. This is not, it's dismissed as petty so often by the police and by the authorities. It's not petty when it happens to you, particularly if you're old and defenceless. And you call the police and they come once and they do nothing.
And they say, we can't do anything.
We can do nothing. And they go, well, there you are left, they're standing in the twilight. And you are thinking, I have absolutely nobody who's going to defend me from this. I am on my own.
Yeah.
What does that do to people? It is a crime. And police should realise that their presence on the street, I keep saying this is the most basic thing, their presence on the street, on foot, regular on foot patrol, transforms millions of lives for the better and makes life much harder for criminals and lowlifes. And they should go back to doing it as their principal occupation. There's no better idea. And if they won't do it, as I say, close down these police forces and replace them with new ones, which will.
Absolutely. Peter, thank you very much. It was Fiona Ann Pilkington who was involved in that case.
Right.
Peter, thanks very much indeed. We'll look forward to seeing you again at the same time next week.